They never told us what to do if she simply wasn't there. Every drill, every briefing, every laminated protocol card tucked inside our dress tunics. All of it assumed the princess would be somewhere. Somewhere we pretty much could form a perimeter around. Somewhere we could defend. The manuals were 47 pages long, and not one of them had a chapter titled, "What Happens When the Room is Just Empty." I've stood outside Buckingham Palace in February, sleet, with my jaw clenched so hard I cracked a molar. I've held formation while a man in Trafalgar Square threw a bottle that shattered 6 inches from my left boot. I have done the thing the British public mistakes for stoicism, which is really just a particular flavor of controlled terror, for 11 years. None, basically, of it prepared me for 4:17 on a Tuesday, or when Sergeant Callum Marsh knocked on my door with his helmet under his arm and said, in a voice that had gone very quiet and very flat, "Sir, she's gone. Not taken. Not escorted. Not relocated under some protocol I hadn't been briefed on. Gone." And what followed, the next 48 hours, was the thing I still can't write in the official log without my hand doing something strange. Not shaking. Something worse than shaking. Something like understanding what we are. What we actually are. And underneath the bearskin and the polish and the ceremony. And what we're capable of when none of that's left. The bed hadn't been slept in. That was the first thing I clocked. Not the open window. Not the absence of the protection officer who should have been posted outside the door. Not even the turned-over glass of water spreading a dark stain across the cream carpet, like a question nobody wanted to ask out loud. The bed, crisp, undisturbed. Plus, pillow-centered basically, but with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested it had been arranged rather than vacated. Someone had made that bed. To be fair, after. I stood in the doorway of Princess Charlotte's private apartments at Kensington for a long time, long enough that Marsh cleared his throat behind me twice. I mean, have a habit. My wife calls it my disaster posture, of going very still when something has gone badly wrong. It started after a training rotation in Kandahar. I don't recommend it as a coping mechanism, but there it's. Door was, locked from the inside when Hargreaves did the 0400 check, Marsh said, reading off his phone with the measured tone of a man who'd already started building the wall he'd need to get through this shift. He had actually to use the secondary key. No sign of forced entry, no alarm trigger, no camera event on either the corridor or the garden-facing exterior. Where's Hargreaves now? Medical. A panic attack. I looked at Marsh, plus he looked at me. Right, I said, which I have been deputy commander of the Specialist Protection Unit for 3 years. In that time, I have managed a knife threat at a charity gala, 2 instances of perimeter breach at Sandringham, and 1 absolute debacle involving an intoxicated journalist and a ceremonial sword at a state dinner. I'll spare you that report. And approximately 9,000 hours of standing in corridors thinking about my pension. I wasn't equipped for this. Nobody was equipped for this, which was the problem. The unit operates on the principle that royal protection is a closed system, every variable accounted for, every exit watched, so every person inside the perimeter vetted down to their childhood dentist. Charlotte was 17. She didn't drive. She, didn't, as far as any of us knew, have an active social life. That extended beyond curated public engagements, and a school in Windsor she attended under escort. She had vanished from a room that was locked from the inside. I crouched next to the overturned glass. The carpet was still wet. Recently done, within the hour of Hargreaves's check. I pressed 2, fingers to the fibers. Cold. We don't use the word missing, I said, standing up. Marsh looked, At me, with an expression I recognized from men who'd been in the job long enough to know when they were being handed an instruction that was really a survival strategy. "No, sir. To be fair," he said. "And we don't call the press office. We don't log anything that uses that word. And we certainly don't—" I stopped, took a breath, which the room smelled of something floral, expensive, and faintly of the cold that had come in from outside. "We locate Her Royal Highness under circumstances of unscheduled movement. That's all this is." "Of course." I started the rotation that morning with 7 officers I trusted absolutely, and 4 I trusted contingently. The 7 were Marsh, Okafor, Lewis, Baines, some 2 women named Price, no relation, and a man called Dunning, who'd been with the unit since before I arrived, and who I suspected knew things about the palace's structural layout that weren't in any schematic I'd been given. I briefed them at 5 o'clock in a storage room near the east stairwell, speaking quietly in the measured cadences of a man who was absolutely not having his worst morning in 3 years of this job. "Discreet," I said. "Plus, contained. We don't involve external agencies until we've exhausted internal resources. We don't alarm the household. We don't—" I looked at each face in turn. "Speculate. We observe. We report. We move." Okafor, who'd been standing with his arms crossed, his jaw working slightly, like he was chewing something he'd already decided was bad, said, "And the king?" The room got very quiet. "The king has been informed that Charlotte had an unsettled night and relocated to a guest suite for rest," I said, and nobody said anything to that, which was its honestly own kind of answer. We split into 3 search patterns, plus Dunning took the below-stairs access and the service corridors. He moved through them like he'd been born in the walls, which I found either reassuring or unsettling depending on the minute. Okafor and Lewis covered the garden perimeter, working outward. Marsh stayed with me. It was Marsh who found the note, plus not in pretty much the room. The room. Everything had been picked over twice already by the time I thought to look at the secondary desk, the small one tucked into the alcove by the window, the one that looked decorative rather than functional. Tucked under the base of an unused lamp was a folded square of palace stationery, no bigger than a playing card. Marsh passed it to me, without speaking. I opened it. 2 lines. Her handwriting. I'd seen it on briefing sheet annotations during escort runs, that looping but precise style. "I'm not in danger. Don't let them tell you otherwise. You'll know where I'm by the time it matters." I stood with that piece of paper for what felt like a very long time. "Her," I said finally. "I guess. Sir." She left. She chose this. I folded the note along its original crease. "This isn't a threat event." "Then what's it?" I looked around the room again. The made bed, the cold, wet carpet, the window. That opened onto nothing but a 2-story drop and a formal garden that was, at 5:30, and full of the particular gray English light that looks like the sky has given up trying. She'd planned it. And the locked door, the overturned glass as a timer, the note placed where only a careful search would find it. 17 years old, and she'd thought through the gap between Hargreaves's 4 o'clock check and the 6 o'clock household staff entry. She'd given herself 2 hours of clean air. She knew our protocols. She'd used them like a map, which, "I don't know yet," I said. Which was true. What I didn't say, what I couldn't put into the version of events I was already composing in. My head for the morning report was the thing that was sitting in my chest like a swallowed stone. She'd written, "Don't let them tell you otherwise." Not "don't worry." Don't let them. TBH, them. By hour 14, I'd stopped logging. Not well, in any official sense. The record was still running. DeMarsh was still entering coordinates and time stamps into the encrypted unit channel with the dogged persistence of a man who's decided that paperwork is the last solid object in a collapsing room. But I'd, stopped writing in the small black notebook I carry in my inside left breast pocket. The one my predecessor left me when he retired with the advice: write what you can't say, burn what you can't write. I couldn't write any of it, because by hour 14, the situation had acquired a second problem, and the second problem had a name. His name was Tom Parker Bowles, Camilla's son, 49 years old, food writer, a man I'd encountered exactly twice before, once at a press function at Clarence's house where he'd been charm incarnate, and once in a corridor outside a private dining room where he'd looked through me the way people look through furniture, and he held the honorific His Royal Highness as a courtesy, the kind of title that exists in that strange purgatory between real power and social decoration. Meaningful enough to require protocol acknowledgement, thin enough that most people forget it by the following Tuesday. He called the unit at 9:47. Plus, I took the call personally, standing in the estate manager's office with the door closed, the phone warm in my hand. Outside the window, so the Kensington garden was doing its pale English thing. Pigeons, gravel, a worlder who'd been told nothing and was trimming a hedge with focused obliviousness. "I'm actually aware," Parker Bowles said without preamble, "that there's been an incident." I told him there had been no incident. I used to be fair, the phrase unscheduled movement, and I said it with the particular tone I'd developed over a decade. Not aggressive, not defensive, the verbal equivalent of a closed door that wasn't, and technically, locked. "I had dinner with Charlotte 3 nights ago," he said. "Actually, she told me something. I think it's relevant." I said nothing. Saying nothing is a skill I've been refining since approximately 2009. She told me she'd found something in her father's private correspondence, something about the duchy arrangements. She was frightened, but she was also— a pause, just long enough to be deliberate. Very clear about what she intended to do with it. "Mr. Parker Bowles," she said if she disappeared, to look at what was being moved through the Sandringham estate accounts in November. The hedge outside continued to be trimmed. A pigeon look landed on the window ledge, regarded me with the blank hostility of a witness who'd decided not to cooperate, and left. "I'll note that," I said. "I need you to understand," he said, "that I'm telling you. This because I'm concerned for her safety, not for any other reason." Of course. I hung up and stood in the office for a moment with the phone in my hand, and I had the thought, not the first time I'd had it in 14 years of this work, but the sharpest, that I'd chosen an interesting profession for a man who fundamentally doesn't enjoy being inside other people's politics. I called Marsh in. I told him what Parker Bowles had said. Marsh listened with his arms at his sides, and his face doing something that wasn't quite an expression. The particular guard school blankness that means I'm processing information that I have decided not to react to until I understand what reacting will cost me. "The Sandringham accounts," he said. "November." "That's—" He stopped. Started again. "Sir, if she found something in the Prince of Wales's correspondence, when she used it, we don't know what she used. But if she did, Marsh," he stopped. I sat down in the estate manager's chair, which creaked in a deeply undignified way. "I need you to find out where Tom Parker Bowles was between midnight and 4 o'clock Tuesday morning." Marsh looked at me with an expression I'd describe as the face of a man adding a new floor to a building he wasn't sure had adequate foundations. "Bondo, you think he knew?" "I think he called us 6 hours after we started searching and opened with, 'I'm aware there's been an incident.' I actually think that's a very specific thing to be aware of before we'd told anyone anything. The next 3 hours were the kind of work that doesn't appear in any briefing document, the lateral. Unglamorous business of cross-referencing, of pulling CCTV timestamps from 3 different palace systems, of calling contacts through channels that technically didn't exist, of building a picture not from evidence, but from the shape of its absences. What we found was this. Parker Bowles had dined alone at a Mayfair restaurant until 22:30. His driver logged a return to his Chelsea address at 23:15. His Chelsea address, had no CCTV coverage on the rear access, and his rear access shared a service lane with a property managed by a shell company registered in Jersey that had received, and this is where Dunning, who had the specific and disconcerting skill of reading financial documents the way most people read menus, went very quiet. 3 transfers from an account connected to the Duchy of Cornwall in September, October, and November. I think I sat with that. Dunning sat across, pretty much, from me with his hands flat on the table, looking at the printed summary like it had personally offended him. "She found this," I said. "She found something," Dunning said. Whether it was "look, this particular string," or "she ran. She ran. She didn't go to her father. She didn't come to us." I looked at the paper. She ran. The room was very quiet for a moment. I stripped Parker Bowles of his access credentials to all royal residences at 16:43 that afternoon. The paperwork classified it as a routine security audit. I worded it very carefully, the way you word things you expect to be read by people you haven't met yet. The title, the HRH, the courtesy designation, the small piece of inherited nomenclature he'd carried since his mother married into the family, that I flagged for immediate review by the Lord Chamberlain's office with a single attached paragraph that I wrote 3 times before I was satisfied with it. It wasn't, technically, a stripping of title, and it was a formal advisement that the honorific was under review pending investigation. In practice, it was the same thing. In practice, I'd just thrown a stone at a window I couldn't see clearly, in a house I wasn't sure of the floor plan of. Marsh appeared in the doorway at 1700 with 2 cups of terrible estate coffee, the look of a man who had news he was deciding how to carry. "We found her," he said. She was in Derbyshire, namely, she was in a farmhouse outside Bakewell that belonged to the family of a school friend, a girl called Rosie Ashworth, whose parents were apparently the kind of people who accepted a princess arriving unannounced on their doorstep at 5 in the morning with a backpack and a look on her face that, by all accounts, discouraged questions. Okafor drove, which I sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked Volvo and watched the M1 unreel in the dark, and I thought about the note she'd left. You'll know where I'm by the time it matters. TBH, she'd been right. 48 hours. She'd calculated it so precisely, it felt less like a plan and more like a proof, a mathematical demonstration, of how little time she needed and how much she understood about the machinery that was supposed to contain her. Okafor didn't speak for most of the drive. This was one of the things I valued about him. A composure that wasn't indifference, a silence that wasn't emptiness. He'd been with the unit 8 years. He had a daughter just turned 12. I'd been at the birthday. Plus, he'd made jollof rice that I still thought about with a frequency I found embarrassing. "Somewhere past Sheffield," he said, without taking his eyes off the road. "Is she in danger?" Not a question. The inflection was flat. He was asking me to tell him what shape the situation was, not what might happen. "I don't think so," I said, which I think she put herself somewhere she calculated we'd eventually find, but not before she'd finished whatever she needed to finish. And what did she need to finish? I looked out the window at the dark field slipping past, the occasional lit motorway service station burning alone against the sky, like something that had forgotten to stop. "I don't know yet," I said. Again. The phrase was becoming a kind of tic, and the verbal equivalent of my disaster posture, the way I went still when the variables stopped adding up. We arrived at 2:30. The farmhouse was stone, low, set back from a lane that the Volvo's navigation had described as a road with an optimism I found touching. The Ashworths had been contacted through a channel I'd have to document vaguely. Local liaison was the term I'd settled on. And they met us at the door with the specific wariness of people who had done nothing wrong and were only now beginning to understand what they'd gotten adjacent to. Charlotte was in the kitchen, which she was sitting at a pine table with a mug of tea gone cold in front of her and a laptop open to one side. And she looked. This is the thing I keep returning to. The detail that won't flatten into report language. Tired. Not frightened, not defiant. Tired in the way of someone who has done a large and difficult thing, is now on the other side of it, and the other side turns out to be just as cold as the starting place. She looked up when I came in. I sat down across from her without being invited. It wasn't protocol. Protocol, at that moment, felt like a language I'd briefly forgotten how to speak. "Sir," she said. Plus, her voice was steady. I'm 17 years old, 48 hours running, and her voice was steady. "Ma'am," I said. We looked at each other. "I suppose you've questions," she said. "I have approximately 800 questions," I said. "I'm going, in my opinion, to ask you one." She waited. "Are you safe?" Something moved across her face. Not quite relief, not quite surprise. Something in the middle. Like she'd prepared for the other 800, and this one had come from a direction she hadn't fully accounted for. "Yes," she said. "I'm safe." "Good." I reached across the table, turned the laptop toward me, and looked at what was on the screen. It was a document. Dense. Financial tables, transfer records, a chain of annotations in a handwriting that wasn't Charlotte's. Older, more impatient. I recognized the handwriting, and I'd seen it on a memo once, years ago. I'm in a briefing about a property dispute I'd been peripherally involved in. The memo had been unsigned, but I'd been told whose desk it had come from. "How long have you been building this?" I said. "Since August." "Pretty much." She wrapped her hands around the cold mug. Look, a tick. Not cold. She was past cold. Like something to hold. I found the first transfer by accident. Plus, I was looking through the Dutchy correspondence for a birthday letter Papa said he'd sent me. I found that instead. "You should have come to us." She met my eyes. "Should I?" she said. And there it was. The thing I couldn't write in. The notebook. The thing that sat in my chest like a stone that was also a question. I had stripped Parker Bowles' credentials. I'd flagged his title. I'd done it, I guess, on the basis of a phone call, a financial connection, and a girl who'd run rather than trust the apparatus that was supposed to protect her. She hadn't run from a threat. She'd run from us. Not all of us, but enough of us that she couldn't calculate the safe ones fast enough. I closed the laptop. "I need to take this." She nodded. She'd known that. "I need you to come with me now." She nodded again. She'd known that too, which I drove her back myself. Okafor in the rear. Charlotte in the passenger seat with her backpack on her lap and her eyes on the motorway. The same dark fields reversed. She didn't sleep. She watched the lit windows of the service stations pass, and said nothing for a very long time. Outside Northampton, she said, "He'll call it a security review, a misunderstanding." I said nothing. "He has friends," she said, "in the office, not yours. Other offices." In my opinion, I kept my eyes on the road. "You should know that," she said, "and before you file anything." We drove in silence the rest of the way. I dropped her at Kensington at 6:18, and the household was already moving. Staff, morning light, or the particular smell of the palace kitchens that hits you even from the courtyard, something buttery and institutional and permanent. She got out, paused, turned back. "Thank you," she said. "And for the one question." I watched her walk inside. I sat in the car for a moment, the engine ticking down. Okafor very quiet in the back seat. The laptop was, in my opinion, in a bag between my feet. The filing deadline for the Parker Bowles review was 9 o'clock, when I hadn't yet decided what the report would say.